for stopping by Sheila's Audiobooks, and I am Sheila. This recording is coming from South Texas. All stories on this recording are in the public domain per United States copyright law. This story is about the Shandon family, particularly the twins Neville and Roger. The likeness between the twins went even deeper than the surface. Both owed their success in life to a certain hardness of character coupled with an abundance of energy. Neville, going to the bar, had made himself feared from the first as a brutal and domineering cross-examiner, and his criminal practice had done little to soften his professional manners. Roger's rise to prosperity had been more mysterious. It was vaguely known that he had made money in South Africa and South America, but the exact methods which had led to his fortune were never discussed by him. He had come home at the age of 45 to find his brother one of the leading lights of the bar. The purchase of the little Whistlefield estate had followed, and Roger had apparently been content to settle down in the countryside and make a clean break with the interests of his past. Murder in the Maze by J. Connington. Chapter 1. The Hackleton Case. Neville Shandon stood at the window of his brother's study gazing contentedly out over the Whistlefield grounds. This was a good place to recuperate in, he reflected, especially when one could only snatch a couple of days at a time from the grinding pressure of a barrister's practice. His eye travelled slowly over the prospect of greenery which lay before him, lawn beyond lawn, down to where a glint of silver showed where the river cut across the estate. Beyond that came the stretches of the low meadows, intersected here and there by the darker green of the hedges, then the long curve of the main road, and at last, closing the horizon, the gentle slope of Longshoot Hill surmounted by its church spire. A bee hummed lazily at the open window, then, startled by a movement, it shot away, the note of its wings growing higher and fainter as it receded in the sunlight. The King's Counsel let his attention wander for a moment to the rooks sailing, in their effortless flight around the tree crests by the river, then, with something more than apparent reluctance, he turned away from the landscape. "You did pretty well when you bought Whistlefield, Roger," he commented as he moved back into the room. "It's as restful a place as I know. If it weren't that I can get down here from time to time, I'd be hard put to it to keep fit for my work. Think of the law courts on a day like this. And that Hackleton case has been a bit of a strain, a bigger business than usual." His twin brother nodded a general assent, but made no audible reply. There was more than the normal family resemblance between the two men. In height and build they were much alike, both were grey-haired and clean-shaven, and even the hard lines at the corners of the barrister's mouth found their counterparts in the deeply chiseled curves which made Roger Shandon's face a slightly forbidding one. Whether deliberately or not, the twins accentuated their physical resemblance by a similarity in their dress. "We have the same tailor," Roger once explained. "When I go to him, I say, 'Make me a suit like my brother's last one.' I believe Neville says the same. The fellow has our measurements, so there's no more needed on that visit. Neville and I have much the same taste in shades, so it generally comes out all right." The likeness between the twins went even deeper than the surface. Both owed their success in life to a certain hardness of character coupled with an abundance of energy. Neville, going to the bar, had made himself feared from the first as a brutal and domineering cross-examiner, and his criminal practice had done little to soften his professional manners. Roger's rise to prosperity had been more mysterious. It was vaguely known that he had made money in South Africa and South America, but the exact methods which had led to his fortune were never discussed by him. He had come home at the age of 45 to find his brother one of the leading lights of the bar. The purchase of the little Whistlefield estate had followed, and Roger had apparently been content to settle down in the countryside and make a clean break with the interests of his past. The third brother, Ernest, seemed hardly to belong to the same family as the twins. Though 5 years younger, he had none of the vitality and energy which were so manifest in his elders, and the contrast was accentuated by the weakness of his eyes, which gazed incuriously at the world from behind the concave lenses of his pince-nez. Left to fend for himself by the time he was 20, and with a couple of hundred a year of his own, he had simply vegetated without even attempting to go into any business, and when his brothers had made their fortunes, he had slipped into the role of parasite without a thought, had transferred himself to Whistlefield, and had continued to live there ever since. Roger had fallen into the habit of giving him a fluctuating allowance, which he eked out as best he could by betting on a small scale. "What's this Hackleton case that you were talking about?" he inquired with a certain dull interest. Neville looked at his brother with an expression half quizzical and half contemptuous. For days the Hackleton case had extended in sordid detail over a good many columns of most daily newspapers, for its intricacy had been enlivened by frequent dramatic interchanges between witnesses and counsel. It had shown Neville Shandon at his best, relentlessly driving the defendants into one damaging admission after another. "Do you never read newspapers, Ernest?" the barrister demanded, quite unnettled by his brother's ignorance of one of the greatest cases in which he himself had taken a leading part. Ernest's interests were limited, as Neville knew, and it was useless to expect him to go outside his normal range merely from family concern. Wide-ranging curiosity was the last quality one could expect from him. Ernest blinked, took off his glasses and cleaned them, then replaced them carefully before replying. "No. At least, not all of them. Confound these glasses, they won't grip my nose today, somehow. This is the 5th time they've fallen off. I often look at the newspapers, Neville. I glance through the sporting news every day. I never read the law column, though. I can't understand it, usually, and when I do understand it, it seems so damn dull. At least, it's dull to me, so I don't look at it, usually." The barrister shrugged his shoulders slightly. He was above petty vanity, and he felt no sting from his brother's lack of interest in his work. "Just as well you left the Hackleton case alone, then," he said. "It's an infernal tangle. It's taken me months of work to see my way through it, and if I happen to break down before it comes to a finish, I doubt if a junior could take it on with anything like success. But I think this week will see the end of it." Roger had listened to the dialogue without moving a muscle. Ernest's complete incuriosity was no surprise to him. He could almost have predicted it. The youngest brother had never had the slightest interest in anything which did not touch himself. Family triumphs meant nothing to him, except that indirectly they contributed to his welfare. The barrister moved again to the window and looked out over the landscape. A cloud of rooks caught his eye, sailing together and then breaking up into a mass of wheeling individuals. "After this sort of thing, the very thought of the air in the law courts makes one sick," he said at last. "Hackleton's coming up for the rest of your cross-examination the day after tomorrow, isn't he?" Roger asked. "Yes. He's a clever devil, sees a concealed point as well as I do myself, and generally manages to skate round it more or less. He's just scraped through, so far, but I'll have him yet. It'll be a bad business for him if he makes a slip. This civil suit for breach of contract is only a preliminary canter, if things turn out as I expect. One single breach in his case, and the public prosecutor will be down on Hackleton instanter. There's ever so much in the background which we can't bring to light in this particular suit, but it would all come out if the thing were to be transferred to the criminal court. Then we could really get to the bottom of the business. So I gathered, by reading the case. Anyone could see that there was a lot in the background that you couldn't touch on. Once it all comes out, it'll be the end of Hackleton. 5 years penal is the least he could look forward to. Pleasant prospect for a man who lives on champagne. He's an amazing fellow, drinks like a fish and yet has almost as good a brain as I have." "And you think you'll get him? Does he realize that?" "I expect he does. From all I've heard of him, he hasn't much to boast of in the way of scruples. He started his career by speculations in coffin ships, didn't he? I seem to remember some trouble with the insurance companies in more than one case." The barrister nodded. "Constructive murder, simply. But that would be a trifle to Hackleton. He'd do anything for money." Roger seemed to turn this over in his mind for a moment or two before he spoke again. "If he's as hard a case as all that, I think I'd put on my considering cap if I were in your shoes, Neville. It seems to me that you're the weak joint in the harness." "I? How do you make that out? I've got this case at my finger ends, I tell you. No one knows it inside out as I do." "That's precisely what I mean. Suppose he loosed a gang of roughs on you before this cross-examination comes off? A good sandbagging would put you out of action for just the time necessary to keep you out of the case, and that's all he needs. You say yourself that you have all the strings in your hands, and I don't suppose you've brought every card out of your sleeve even for the benefit of your junior. It wouldn't be like you if you have. You were always one to keep a good deal in reserve. That's true enough, Neville conceded with a grim smile. No one could handle Hackleton in just the way that I shall this week. But I'm not particularly afraid of sandbags or that sort of thing. No one could tackle me here, so far as I can see. One can't do that kind of business in broad daylight on the Whistlefield lawns. And there won't be much chance of getting at me on the way up to town or in London itself. I quite admit the possibility of the thing when one's dealing with Hackleton. It's quite on the cards, and because it's never been done before, there's no reason why it shouldn't be done sometimes. I'm not nervous, of course, but I'm not likely to run any risks by going about much after dark until this affair is squared up. Roger Shandon's face reflected the grimness of his brother's smile. I quite understand what you feel about it. In fact, I'm in much the same boat myself. That's what turned my mind to the possibility in your case. The barrister glanced at him keenly. Some more of your disreputable past cropping up, eh? I don't care much for some of your old acquaintances. Who's this fresh one? Roger grinned shamelessly. His brother knew something of the way in which he had made his money, for at times it had been useful to Roger to take legal advice without bringing an outsider into problems which came too near the edge of the law. It's another gentleman with a grievance, from Cape Town this time, he explained. He says he acted as my agent in some I.D.B. business when I was out there. He says that I got the profit out of it and that the profit was big enough to split comfortably into two. According to him, I gave him away to the authorities later on, and he spent a period of retirement, on the breakwater or some such health resort. The cure took some years in the sanatorium, and he hated the treatment. Too much open-air exercise with plain food, and too many uniforms about for his taste. That part's true enough, he's just out of jail. As to the rest, he needn't expect me to corroborate it on oath. Blackmail, I suppose? Asked the barrister, perfunctorily. I'll have a talk with him, if you like. Perhaps my persuasive style, the harsh lines about his mouth deepened, would help to convert him to honesty. It'll be no trouble. Roger nodded his thanks. I'll turn you on if necessary, but it's hardly likely. He seems to me a vaporing sort of beast. Your money or your lifestyle a thing, you know. When I naturally refused point-blank to pay him a stiver, he frothed over at once with threats to do me in. Tim Costock, the red-handed avenger, and all that sort of thing. I left him frothing. He didn't seem to me the sort of type that would do more than froth, and he can prove nothing. I don't suppose he can. Neville agreed, knowing from past experience that his brother left very little behind him for enemies to pick up. Well, I want to run over my notes for the Hackleton case this afternoon. Where can I find a place where I'll be free from interruption? With these youngsters in the house, one can never be sure of having a room to oneself for half an hour at a time, and even if one retires to one's bedroom, somebody's sure to start a duel with the piano. I thought piano playing had gone out of fashion, but I've heard it every day since I came here. That's Arthur, Roger Shandon interjected, irritably. No one else touches the damned thing. Ernest had apparently been cogitating deeply. He now turned a dull eye on his elder brother. Try the maze, he advised. What do you mean by that? Demanded Neville. Try the maze? It sounds like an advertisement for tea or one of these riddles, like, why is a hen? Ernest elaborated his suggestion. I mean the maze, he explained laboriously. The thing like the one at Hampton Court, down by the river, close to the boathouse. None of the visitors is likely to find a way to either of the centers, and none of us is likely to disturb you. We don't usually go there, at least, I don't myself. Neville's face had shown enlightenment at the first sentence. Oh, our maze, you mean? We were talking about the piano when you burst in, Ernest, and I didn't quite take the connection. That's not a bad notion. As you say, nobody's likely to bother me if I plant myself in either of the centers. Besides, I want all the fresh air I can get just now. It'll be better out there than anywhere inside the house. Right. I'll go to Helen's bower. He moved towards the door as he spoke, but before he reached it a piano sounded not far off, and the opening bars of Sinding's Frühlingsrauschen came to their ears. Neville turned back with his hand on the door handle. By the way, Roger, what about that young nephew of ours? He seems all right, a bit moody, perhaps, but nothing out of the common. What does the doctor say? Roger's face clouded. Arthur? He's a young pest. About thrice a week he takes a fancy to the piano, and then he spends the whole day playing one piece over and over again, like an automatic machine, except for the mistakes. Damnable. You don't know how I hate the sound of the spring song and Frühlingsrauschen. You must have heard him at it this morning, and now he's starting all over again. The barrister nodded. Yes, but what about his general tone? He asked. Has he got over the encephalitis completely? Did the Harley Street man find anything permanently wrong? Roger's face betrayed little satisfaction. Oh, the specialist looked devilish wise the last time he examined him, but that was about all it amounted to. It seems they know next to nothing about sleepy sickness. I understood him to say that the brain cells are all churned up with the inflammation, and the result may be anything you please. Of course Arthur was lucky to get off with no physical damage, his eyesight and hearing and all that are quite all right. But it seems one can never tell what changes may have taken place in the brain structure, things that don't normally show at all. He may be all right, for all one can tell. Or again, he might turn into a homicidal maniac any day, and then, as like as not, he'd go for the nearest relation handy. A nice sort of fellow to have in one's neighborhood. The barrister evidently considered this prophecy exaggerated. He seems quite normal to me, he said. Oh, I don't worry much over him, Roger admitted. It's just that he's got on my nerves so much that I can hardly see him without snapping at him. I'll have to get rid of him, I think, send him on a sea voyage or something of that sort. Perhaps you get on his nerves, just the same way as he gets on yours, Ernest began in his low voice. That's what usually happens. When one starts it, the other takes it up. Usually that's the way these things go. I shouldn't wonder. Hello, Sylvia. I didn't expect you just yet, not for quite a while. I'm not quite ready. A girl in her early 20s had come into the room and now stood looking at her uncle with a fair pretense of indignation. Sylvia Hawkhurst, the sister of the piano-playing Arthur, had been left an orphan before she came of age, and as her uncles were her trustees, she and her brother had been brought to Whistlefield by Roger Shandon. She liked to play at housekeeping, as she put it, and Roger soon learned that she could run his small establishment better than any paid housekeeper. Things went like clockwork after she had taken command, and he soon realized that the secret of her management was that everyone in the house adored her. One thing she had set her face against: we'll have no men servants, if you please, uncle, at least, not in the house itself. I don't mind a chauffeur, of course. But I know what a girl can do, and I'd prefer to keep within my limitations, if it's all the same to you. Her uncle had let her have her way, and he had never found any reason to complain of the results. Sylvia's housekeeping, however, occupied very little of her time. She hunted in the season, drove her own car, played tennis well and golf better still, and was reckoned one of the best dancers in the neighborhood. Most characteristic of all, in spite of her looks, she was as popular with girls as with men. As she came into the room, Ernest got out of his chair with his usual deliberation and began a faintly shamefaced apology for his unpreparedness, but she cut him short in mock irritation. He hasn't even got his boots on, she complained. How is it that I can run everything to time in this house except you? Are you ever in time for anything, Uncle Ernest? I always seem to have so much to do, Sylvia, usually. It's been a very busy day. The corners of Sylvia's mouth quivered a little in spite of her effort to look indignant. Very busy. I remember exactly what you did. You played tennis for precisely 35 minutes this morning. Then you organized a grand shooting tournament with the air guns and bored everyone stiff with it except Arthur, who happens to be able to beat everyone else. Then you came into the house, and I suppose you looked at the newspapers till lunch. And since then, you've sat and smoked. You must be dog-tired, poor thing. Do you think you could wrestle with your boots now, or shall I have them brought here on a silver salver and give you a hand with them myself? I'd rather not, so if you can manage by yourself, I'll go and bring the car round. Put your watch in front of you and pinch yourself once a minute. Then you won't fall quite asleep. Do hurry up, Uncle, she concluded, more seriously. I want to get off as soon as I can. Where are you taking him? Asked Roger. I'm going over to Stanley Village to do some shopping first of all, then I'm going to the Naylands to ask them to come across and play tennis. When Uncle Ernest heard that, he begged me to take him along part of the way and drop him at the East Gate, so that he could walk along the main road to the bridge and have a look at the river. I thought I'd like to see if it was worth fishing, just at present, Ernest added, in further explanation. I've been thinking about it for a day or two, but I've never found time, somehow. Usually, just when I was starting out, something always seemed to come in the way. So today, since Sylvia was going that way in the car anyhow, I thought. He broke off, observing Sylvia's indignant eyes fastened upon him. Boots, she said, scathingly, and held the door open for him to go out. I'll be ready in a minute or two, he assured her hastily as he left the room. Men are a wonderful lot, aren't they? She said confidentially to her two remaining uncles as the door closed. It seems to me high time Uncle Ernest got married. He's simply incapable of looking after himself. You two are at least able to cross the street for yourselves, but Uncle Ernest really gives me a lot of worry. I think I saw a fresh wrinkle when I was brushing my hair this morning. I wondered what made you look peculiar at lunchtime, Neville admitted. Now you mention it, I see it on your brow. About as deep as this. He touched one of the deep scored lines running down to the side of his own mouth. Sylvia laughed. You alarm me, Uncle. I must have a look at the ravages in a mirror before I venture out. Goodbye. She hurried out of the room. Neville looked at his watch. Time I was moving, he said. I think I'll take Ernest's advice and try the maze for seclusion. It's hardly likely that anyone will bother to go into it this afternoon, and I can't stand this piano playing of Arthur's. It grows irritating, as you say. I'll go now. But I must get my notes first. A thought seemed to strike Roger as the barrister opened the door. I think I'll try the maze myself this afternoon. I feel a bit sleepy, and it's quiet in there. I shan't disturb you. But if it's all the same to you, I'll take Helen's bower myself. I'm used to a chair there, it suits me. You can go to Narcissus's pool instead. There's nothing to pick and choose between them, since they're both in the maze. Very good, the barrister agreed. It's all the same to me, so long as no one interrupts me. He nodded abruptly and left the room. When his brother had gone, Roger Shandon went over to his writing table and busied himself with some papers. The distant piano seemed to have become more intrusive now that he was left alone. It repeated Frühlingsrauschen with brain-wearying persistence and a reiterated error in one particular chord. Roger frowned irritably as he busied himself with the documents before him, jotting down a note from time to time on a scribbling block. Damn that young whelp. I must talk to him about this. One can't concentrate one's attention when half one's mind's wondering if he's going to make that same slip for the 101st time. He continued his work for a few minutes, then rose and rang the bell. Send Mr. Stenness, if you can find him, he ordered when the maid appeared. In Ivor Stenness, Roger had secured an ideal private secretary. Stenness not only had the efficiency of a machine, but he possessed a full measure of qualities hardly less important. If his employer was out of sorts, even the gruffest order failed to ruffle the secretary's temper. He was capable of taking just the right amount of responsibility in emergencies without ever going a hair's breadth over the score. And his especial recommendation in Roger's eyes was that he could keep his mouth shut. He never asked for explanations which might have been difficult to give, and he never betrayed the slightest surprise when, as sometimes happened, he opened threatening letters. "If I ever have a confession of murder to put on paper," Roger used to say, "Stenness will take it down in shorthand, type it out, and get my signature, without turning a hair." So far as he was concerned, it would be just a letter. Stenness's other qualities were more in demand among the remainder of the household. He had good natural manners, and he could play games well enough to make him useful where someone was often needed to make up a golf foursome or a bridge table. A casual glance at him would have suggested that he must employ a first-class valet, for his clothes always looked new and he had the knack of carrying them well. With all this, he was a perfectly safe person to have in a house with a young girl. He was, somehow, too inhumanly efficient to be attractive to girls younger than himself, and he showed not the slightest desire to attract. Sylvia treated him as a good friend, but she had dozens of friends whom she treated in exactly the same fashion. "Ah, Stenness." Roger looked up as the secretary came in. "I've gone over these letters and jotted down some notes. You might get them off sometime today. There's only one of them that needs any explanation. Here it is." Neville Shandon's grim face appeared at the door for a moment. In his hand was a sheaf of papers. Seeing his brother engaged with the secretary, he nodded without saying anything and closed the door behind him. Roger continued his explanation of the matter in hand while the secretary took a note or two. As the instructions ended, the whir of a car leaving the front of the house attracted Roger's attention, and he crossed the room to look out of the window. Sylvia was driving, and beside her was Ernest Shandon. They glanced up as they passed under the study window, and Sylvia waved her hand. Roger watched the car swing sharply off the main avenue on its way to the east gate, and soon it vanished behind a belt of rhododendrons. They might have given Neville a lift, Roger reflected as he turned back into the room again. They'll be passing the maze on the road to the east gate. The sound of the piano reasserted itself in the comparative silence which followed the passing of the car. Roger made a gesture of impatience. "I suppose that's my nephew playing?" he demanded. "He was shooting darts at a target in the garden, a short time ago," Stenness explained, "but I think he came in a few minutes ago." "It sounds like him. Since he had that attack of sleepy sickness he always fumbles a bit on his chords, doesn't seem able to manage his fingers perfectly. That makes this din all the harder to bear." Stenness refrained from any comment. Roger, after a pause, continued irritably. "Where are the visitors, Stenness? I wish they'd attract him out of the house. Some days he's all right and one never sees him. Other days he sits and pounds that piano till one's head rings with it. I noticed Miss Forrest and Mr. Torrance going towards the rose garden a few minutes ago." Stenness confined himself to answering the direct question and quietly ignored Roger's exasperation. It was no business of his to intervene in family squabbles. "Well, that's all I have for you at present, Stenness. As you're passing the door, send my nephew to me, will you? I must put a stop to this nuisance. It's gone on quite long enough." The secretary made a gesture of assent, then gathered up his papers and left the room. A few seconds later, the piano playing stopped abruptly in the middle of a bar, and Roger's ear caught the clang of the keyboard lid being carelessly slammed. After a moment or two, his nephew entered the study. In order to give his irritation time to cool down, Roger refrained from speaking immediately. He motioned his nephew to sit down, whilst he himself pulled out his cigar case and became busy with the preparations for a smoke. Having got his cigar well alight, he turned round. "Must you hammer that piano for hours at a time, Arthur? I hate to interfere with your simple pleasures, of course, but the infernal din you make has had quite a long enough run. You've played Frühlingsrauschen at least 24 times today, and that's just 24 times oftener than I want to hear it. You can cut it out of the bill, after this. In fact, you can leave the piano alone, once for all. I'm sick of hearing you play. You're a nuisance to everyone, raising pandemonium at all hours of the day. Find some quieter amusement, or clear out of the house." Arthur Hawkhurst's eyebrows rose in mild surprise at his uncle's complaint. "I'd no idea it worried you, uncle." Well, drop it. Perhaps I have been overdoing Frühlingsrauschen a bit. I hadn't thought of that. Somehow I never seem to get through it without a mistake in one or two chords, and I want to make a clean job of it, once at least. I've got a pair of quite good ears. You needn't think I missed your mistakes. They make it more irritating, that's all. Arthur hastened to admit his errors. Well, no more Frühlingsrauschen, then. What about the Barcarolle? Offenbach's, I mean. Any objection to that? Yes. Will you be good enough to understand that you're not to bang on that piano again? Oh, you mean it? I thought it was just your fun, Uncle. But I like the piano. Surely you'll let me use it sometimes. No. I've had enough of it. But Roger's face had been darkening. That's enough. I've more important things to talk to you about. What age are you nowadays? 22 or 23, isn't it? And you've never done a stroke of work in your life, so far? A pretty record, isn't it? He paused, and paced over to the window and back again. That's got to stop. I've had to support one loafer, your Uncle Ernest. But if you imagine that I have a fad for collecting loafers, you're mistaken. I've got your uncle on my hands permanently, I suppose, but I don't propose to increase my stock of parasites for your benefit. You'll have to find something to do. I'm not going to let you hang around Whistlefield forever. Arthur's good-natured face had darkened in its turn. You might increase your stock of politeness without overdoing things, it seems to me. I'm not altogether a loafer. I'm an invalid. Roger took no notice of the plea. Whistlefield isn't a hospital. Or an asylum, I suppose that's what you mean. You'd better take care, Uncle. There are some things a fellow doesn't forget, once they're said. Roger's temper, never very far below the surface, boiled up at his nephew's remark. That's enough, Arthur. I'll give you 3 months more. After that, you can fend for yourself. You won't starve. You've got enough money to keep you alive even if the worst comes to the worst. Anyhow, I wash my hands of you. Arthur Hawkhurst's control was no better than his uncle's when once the point had penetrated through the skin. A pretty specimen of an uncle. The kind one meets in the Babes in the Wood, eh? Go out into the world and starve, Arthur dear. The little dicky birds will put leaves on you, and I'll get the money your mother left you. That's the scheme, I suppose. It's a wonder a thing like you is allowed to live. The flagrant absurdity of the charge checked Roger for a moment. After all, the boy was off his balance. One shouldn't take him seriously. You're an ass, Arthur, was all he vouchsafed in reply. But Arthur's disturbed brain had tilted out of its normal equilibrium, and his rage found vent in a wild threat as he flung himself out of the room. I've a good mind to get in first myself, and do for you, before you can do me any more harm. Look out for yourself. As the door slammed behind his nephew, Roger settled himself back into his chair. Arthur's outbreak had come as a complete surprise. Since his illness, the boy had given the impression that he merely needed a firm hand. He had loafed about the house in a condition not far from melancholia, and at first it had required steady pressure to bring him to take any interest in normal affairs. Gradually he had improved and had passed over into a state of cheerful irresponsibility. And now, just as the specialists were taking an optimistic view of the future, had come this collapse into something which seemed little short of mania, absolutely without warning. I'll have to get this looked into, Roger reflected. He's evidently not so far on the road to recovery as we thought. Arthur's threat had left him completely indifferent. He had almost forgotten it when he rose again from his chair. In itself it seemed unimportant, merely some wild words flung out in a brainstorm. He left the house and took the road to the maze. Stenness saw his figure pass into the belt of rhododendrons, and as soon as it had disappeared, the secretary made his way to Roger's study. An ABC timetable was on one of the shelves, and Stenness, taking it down, began to study the times of trains. I can't leave it later than that, he said to himself at last. The next one wouldn't get me into London in time for the boat train. His eye turned to the window and ranged over the lawns. Well, it'll be a hard wrench to leave here, no matter what happens. And I wish I saw tonight over and knew where I stand. He passed to a fresh line of thought. At the worst, nothing will matter much if I don't pull it off. He replaced the ABC on its shelf and went up to his own room. First locking the door, he began deliberately to pack his razors and other toilette articles in an attaché case. When he had completed this task, he glanced round the room. Nothing else? No, all the rest of the stuff is waiting for me in London. Chapter 2. The Affair in the Maze. Howard Torrance fidgeted a little and then turned to the girl beside him. A bit feeble, just sitting about like this and doing nothing. Care to go down to the tennis courts and play a single? Vera Forrest knew the symptoms well. A good many men would have been glad enough of the chance to monopolize her and would have asked nothing better than to sit there in the shade in her company. But Howard had a surplus of physical energy which could be worked off only by continual exercise. "What'll we do next?" was a phrase which ran through his talk like a reiterated battle cry, and he seemed to have exalted sloth to the premier position in his private catalogue of the mortal sins. She glanced at him mischievously and decided to tease him a little before letting him have his way. "No, thank you," she said, sedately. Howard had a second suggestion ready. "Want to go over to the links and play a few holes?" "No, thanks." "What about taking the car to Stanningley? I need some cigarettes and I'll stand you a box of chocolates." "No." Howard looked at her suspiciously. "Is this a new game?" "No, thank you." "No, thanks." "No." Trying to make it shorter each time, is that it? Well, you've got to the bottom of the bag this shot. This is where the master brain says checkmate. Ahem. Like to take a boat out on the river for a while. You can't say no in less than 2 letters. Vera made no audible response, but she shook her head in refusal. Her companion admitted his defeat gracefully. "Didn't think you'd manage it. You win. Will you have a saucepan or a cheap alarm clock? All the other prizes have been awarded already." Then, as though dismissing trifles and becoming serious. "What's to be done? We can't sit around like this the whole day. Time's on the wing, and all that." Vera looked at the shadows on the grass. "It's getting on certainly. We really haven't time to do much before tea." "It couldn't miss that, I suppose? It wants its tea?" "It wants its tea," Vera admitted, gravely. Howard looked at his watch. "Pity we wasted the best part of the afternoon just sitting round and loafing," he commented disconsolately. For a few moments he remained silent, evidently turning various projects over in his mind. "Tell you what," he suggested at last. "Ever been in the old maze down there by the boathouse?" "No. Neither have I. What about dashing over and trying our luck with it? Part at the entrance, and the first that gets to the center wins the game. They say it's a grand puzzler." "Well, if it will make you happy, I don't mind. But wait a moment. Hasn't the maze got 2 centers? Somebody told me that once." Howard brushed the objection aside. "The first one to reach either center scores a win. If you get there, sing out. I'll trust your native honesty to keep you from cheating." It was comfortable under the trees, and Vera attempted to put off the evil moment of departure even by a few seconds. "How many entrances has the maze?" "Oh, don't know, exactly. 4 or 5, I think. Nothing in that. Take the first one we come to, whichever it is. Then you go to the right and I'll go to the left, or t'other way about if you like, and the best man wins. I'll risk a box of chocolates or a tin of cocoa on it, if you insist. Come along, don't let's decay here any longer. I see a bit of moss has grown on my toe since we sat down, and no wonder." Vera gave in and rose from her seat with feigned reluctance. "Bit stiff in the joints with sitting so long?" Howard inquired, sympathetically. "It'll wear off at once." As they sauntered across the stretches of turf which led down to the maze, Vera was struck by the quietness of the grounds. Whistlefield's a lovely place, isn't it, Howard? Top hole, he agreed, cordially. First-class tennis courts, good golf course only a quarter of an hour away, the river's quite decent for punting, plenty of room in the house to dance, and I believe they run a pack of otter hounds somewhere in the neighborhood. I didn't know you were a house agent. Howard saw the dig, but took no offense. Sounds a bit like their patter, doesn't it? Company's water, gas, and electric light. Telephone. Main drainage. Well, nothing to be ashamed of, is it? Whistlefield's all right. Sylvia's lucky to be here. By the way, where has she gone to this afternoon, do you know? I haven't seen her since lunch. Off in the car to see some people and arrange for some tennis tomorrow. I must say Sylvia looks after one well when one comes to stay. Always on the go. Where are the rest of the villagers? One uncle's off with Sylvia. The other two were in the study when I saw them last. Stenness is somewhere around. I met young Arthur when you sent me up to the house a few minutes ago. He was coming out of the gun room with a nasty look in his eye and an air gun in his hand. Gave him a cheery hail and got a grunt in reply. Seemed peevish about something or other, quite fretful, even. Wished him good hunting and asked him if he was going to shoot rabbits in the spinney. All I got was a growl that he was going to shoot something sitting if he couldn't shoot it any other way. Seemed determined to work off bad temper by slaughtering something, no matter what. Vera's face betrayed sympathy. Poor Arthur. It's hard lines on that boy, Howard. He's been changed a good deal by that beastly illness he had. Howard's expression showed that he shared her feelings. Pity. Used to be a bright lad. All right, even yet, but not quite the same, somehow. Moody at times, and apt to loaf about doing nothing for half the day. No real go in him. A queer temper, too, some days. When I met him just now, for instance, he looked ready to bite me in the gizzard. Not at all the society man. Vera dismissed the subject, which threatened to throw a gloom over them both. They liked Arthur Hawkhurst, in spite of the occasional flashes of abnormality which he had shown since the attack of encephalitis lethargica. You're playing quite fair, aren't you, Howard? You've never been inside the maze at all. You don't suppose I'd cheat for the sake of winning a tin of cocoa, do you? It's amazing what a low view of mankind some girls have. Soured from the cradle, what? And born in suspicion, belike. Shake it off, or it'll grow on you, Vera. Go and dig in the garden when you feel an attack coming on. Oh, don't rub it in. I know your motto well enough, perspiration is better than cure, or something like that, isn't it? I only asked out of idle curiosity. No reflections on your honesty really intended. Your apology of even date duly received and filed. Sounds like the house agent vein again, that, doesn't it? Come on, I'll race you this last 100 yards and give you a start to that rhododendron. Half a tin of cocoa on the event, since you're so mercenary. Vera rejected his offer, and they walked over the last lawn to the nearest entrance to the maze. The maze at Whistlefield was a relic of earlier days when such things were fashionable, but it had been kept in good repair, and Roger Shandon's gardeners spent a considerable amount of labor in clipping its topiary hedges into the semblance of green walls. Somewhat irregular in outline, it covered about half an acre of ground, but into that limited space there was compressed more than half a mile of pathways, and the shortest route to either of the centers was at least 250 yards in length. But few except experts could have found their way to either Helen's Bower or the Pool of Narcissus by walking a mere 250 yards. The Whistlefield maze was a labyrinth far exceeding in complexity its kindred at Hatfield and Hampton Court. Its 12-foot hedges were impenetrably thick, and in its design it followed the island pattern to such an extent that incautious explorers might wander by the hour through its tiny archipelago without gaining a foot towards the innermost recesses or even realizing that they were simply coasting round and round the outline of some detached hedge. So many people had got temporarily lost in the labyrinth and, being so far away from the house, had been unable to get help even by shouting, that at last precautions had been taken to avoid mishaps of the kind in future. As Vera and her companion reached the tall iron gate in the outer hedge which marked one of the entrances, they found themselves confronted with a small notice board to which an old-fashioned horn was suspended. Visitors entering the maze are advised to take this horn with them so that they can summon assistance if necessary. On leaving the maze, kindly hang the horn in its place again. Howard went up to the board and read the notice with obvious contempt. Nice lot of incompetence they seem to have about the house. He commented in a scathing tone. I wonder they don't provide a bath chair and a man to push you to the center, and be done with it. As if any person of ordinary intelligence couldn't find his way through a thing about the size of a washing green. Ever been in a maze before? Vera inquired. No, not that I can remember. Ah, then kindly unhook the horn and give it to me. I'm not proud. Howard took the horn from its place and handed it over. What's the good of one horn, since we're not going in together? Vera looked him over coldly. When I get lost, I shall blow the horn and get someone to show me the way out. When you get lost, you'll be able to practice breathing exercise in yelling for help. You see, you've got a much louder and harsher voice than I have. You'll be all right, I'm sure. But if you think you can't come up to the lung power needed, you might go round to the next entrance and see if there isn't a horn there. I should think there's sure to be one at each entrance. Howard was put on his mettle. Oh, I shan't get lost. Don't fret too much about me. Now then, who's for the center? Come along, then. I'll take the left-hand path here, and you can go to the right. Whoever gets first to the center can shout I win. And then start for the exit door. If it's a tie at the center, then the first one out is the winner. Keep a tight hold on your honesty and don't shout unless you get to the center. These are all the directions necessary, I think. Now, go. Vera hurried along a straight corridor for some 20 yards and then turned sharply to the right as the path altered its direction. On again, until a promontory of hedge forced her to diverge into a recess in the greenery, from which she emerged again into the main track. Another corner to the right was turned and now she seemed to have come into a cul-de-sac. Rather a sell if I've chosen a blind alley at the very start, she thought to herself. Howard would jubilate over that when he found out about it. However, on reaching the wall of hedge which seemed to bar her way, she came upon a concealed turning to the right. After walking all that distance, I'm still on the very outer rim of this maze. However, this turn's going to take me in towards the center. Up to that point her progress had been simplicity itself, but now alternative paths began to open up every few yards. The tall hedges cut off everything but the sky, and soon she found that she had completely lost her bearings and was wandering at random. For a time she hurried forward, choosing always those turnings which seemed likely to bring her nearer to where she supposed the center to lie, but at last the continual windings confused her so much that she could not even tell in which direction to walk in order to reach the inner reaches of the labyrinth. Long zigzag corridors ended, time after time, in blank walls, and in traversing them forwards and back again she grew more and more doubtful of her bearings. When she thought of taking the sun as a reference point, it was too late, for by that time she had lost all notion of her whereabouts. I'm sure I've seen that patch of withered leaves in the hedge more than once before, she said to herself, halting to examine it more carefully. Yes, I'm certain I passed it a few minutes ago. I must be coming back in my tracks and just going over the same ground again and again. With the dying out of her own footfalls, the silence of the maze impressed itself on her, and she strained her ears to catch the sound of Howard as he moved somewhere beyond these impenetrable green living walls. If I really get stuck in here, she reflected, I can always blow the horn and bring someone who knows the place to lead me out. She listened again, more intently. Then, suddenly there was no need to strain her ears. First came a dull thud, which unconsciously she recognized as familiar, though she could not identify it at the moment. Then, almost at the same instant, a man's voice gave an inarticulate cry in which surprise, pain, and anger seemed to be mingled. A moment of silence, then a peculiar metallic grating reached her ears, followed by a second thud and a fresh cry of pain. Again came the familiar metallic rasping, Yet another of these familiar dull concussions, and then, lower this time, a last cry. Then there was silence once more. Vera stood paralyzed by what she had heard. In a flash of enlightenment she guessed that behind these inexplicable events some tragedy was in progress, something dreadful was happening quite close at hand, though screened from her by the high green walls which shut her in. She had never heard that note in a man's voice before. Utterly shocked by the unexpected revelation of violence, she stood for a moment with her knees trembling under her, while her pulse beat in her throat so heavily as to prevent her uttering a sound. Then, with an effort, she found her voice. "Howard? Are you there? What's happened? Oh, what's happened?" "I'm here." She could not make out from which direction his shout came. The towering hedges seemed to deflect sound so that it was impossible to determine even approximately the position of a speaker. "What were those cries, Howard? What's happened?" "I don't know," he answered. "Somebody hurt. But I can't get to the place. Stay where you are, Vera. I'll see if I can find my way to you." She listened intently in the silence that followed. Feet moved in the maze. Evidently Howard was doing his best to make in her direction. But beyond this she could detect no other noise, though she strained her ears to the utmost. She had expected to hear groans from the wounded man, but nothing broke the stillness until Howard called to her again. His voice seemed farther off than before. "Shout, will you, Vera? I've lost your direction." She called again, and he replied. But as she listened, his footsteps seemed to recede and die away in the distance. Evidently he had found that the direct path was blocked and had had to retreat up some alley to try a fresh start. Then, with surprise at her previous forgetfulness, she bethought herself of the horn in her hand. That would bring assistance. She ought to have remembered it before. The shock had put it out of her mind. She was in the act of lifting it to her lips when again her nerves were shaken by a new cry from the inner recesses of the maze. "Murder!" She recognized Howard's voice, tinged with horror. It was a loud-voiced ejaculation rather than a cry for assistance, she felt with relief. Howard hadn't run into a trap. Before she could pull herself together, he shouted again, this time with the full strength of his lungs. "Murder! See that no one gets away from the maze." Vera's nerves were almost attuned to the shock of the discovery. A picture of some swift and terrible act of violence crossed her mind. It must have been soon over, for she remembered that after the 3 cries she had heard no sound of any sort. Not 20 yards from her, it might be, a human being had been battered out of existence, and but for these cries she would have known nothing whatever. She raised her voice again. "Howard. I'm frightened. What's happened?" "One of the Shandons has been killed. I blundered into the center, trying to get to you. There's blood on his coat." He broke off for a moment, evidently gathering his breath, then again he shouted. "Murder! Help! Here in the maze! Murder!" Vera held her breath, listening eagerly for some answering cry from the outer world which now seemed so peaceful and unattainable. Then in the silence, she heard the sound of a man running hard in the alleys of the maze. "Is that you, Howard?" she called. "I hear someone running not far from where I am." No sooner had she spoken than the noise of running footfalls ceased abruptly. "Is that you, Howard?" she called again, nervously. There came a sound of rustling and tearing, then Howard's voice sounded across the labyrinth. "I'm here. I'm trying to get to you. I tried climbing the hedge, but it's no good." "What did you say?" "I didn't catch it." "There's somebody moving about in the maze, Howard. I heard his footsteps." Howard Torrance's voice replied with that baffling indeterminateness in direction which the maze seemed to impart. "Can you hear me, Vera?" "Yes." "Well, don't utter another sound. Don't use the horn. Keep absolutely quiet and try to make your way out of the maze. If anyone comes round the corner, yell your head off, but unless you see something, keep silent and step softly. There's someone in the maze, and I don't want him to know where you are." Vera leaned against the high hedge for a minute or two, trying to overcome the panic into which Howard's last words had plunged her. He had been careful not to put the thing to her nakedly, but she saw what lay behind his directions. The murderer was still in the maze, and on his way out he might come upon her. If he did, she would be too dangerous a witness to leave alive. She need expect no mercy. And what hope of escape would she have? There, shut in among these towering walls, isolated from all help in the intricacies of the maze, it would be an easy business to silence her finally. She listened intently once more, but no sound came to her ears. The murderer seemed to have made his way into some remoter part of the maze. Suddenly a clatter at her feet startled her into an agony of terror. It was the horn which she had allowed to slip from her hand in the intensity of her concentration upon the sounds about her. She stooped to pick it up again, then, thinking that it would merely hamper her, she let it lie where it had fallen. But at once came the realization that the sound of its clash upon the path must have betrayed her position, if the murderer were lurking at hand. She tried to listen again, but her heart was hammering and the pulsing of the blood in her ears drowned all external sounds. A lump seemed to gather in her throat and she felt as though she would choke. With a physical effort she fought down her difficulties. Hysteria, she told herself. If I give way to it, I'll be putting myself straight into the brute's hands. At last the rustle in her ears subsided as she was able to listen again. For a few instants she heard nothing. Then, quite close at hand, a dry twig cracked as though someone had set his foot on it. The murderer had not left the maze. She felt almost unable to stir, but at last she forced herself into motion. Anything was better than staying in the place where the assassin might have heard her drop the horn. Softly she stole down the corridor. Once she had begun to move, all her impulse was to break into a run, but she fought hard against it. If I begin to run, I'm done for, she thought. I'd go on running. I wouldn't be able to run to a corner, and it's at the corners I must be careful, or I may run full tilt into him. And then her mind, despite herself, conjured up vivid pictures of that meeting. She could see a vague figure rising to block her passage. With an almost physical shrinking she thought of it with a knife in its hand, the blade dripping with the blood of the earlier victim. It came over her how safe and peaceful the normal world was, and now, in pursuit of an aimless piece of amusement, she had come into the slaughterhouse. The Minotaur was afoot in the labyrinth. At the end of the alley she forced herself to halt and peeped cautiously round the corner. No one was in sight, so she ventured into a fresh avenue. Then came a fork in the path, and she took the passage which seemed to offer the longest clear view ahead. Then another corner, and more precautions. She was moving at random now, all her attention concentrated on avoiding the unseen assassin. Once she heard steps. Someone was walking on the opposite side of the hedge against which she was crouching. She held her breath, pictured the terrific figure which she had conjured up. He was stepping lightly like herself, and she almost feared that he would hear the beating of her heart, so near did he come. Then, when she thought she could bear it no longer, the footfalls receded softly into the distance. If that happens again, I'll shriek, she said to herself. I simply couldn't go through it twice. 2 more corners rounded in safety, then in a straight alley a metallic object glittered at the foot of the hedge, and with a sinking heart she recognized it as the horn she had dropped. I'm back again at the same place. I'll never get out of this trap. Again she started, stepping as softly as possible, but to her strained ears the sound of her footsteps seemed to echo and re-echo along the green-walled corridors. What a fool I am! I ought to have taken off my shoes long ago. Then I could go as quick as I please, without making any noise. She slipped off her shoes, and some of her confidence came back when she found how silently she could move. Now I must keep things in my head and get off the track I followed last time. At one remembered turning, she took a fresh track and stole along it with every precaution. Again she heard the sound of steps, but they were farther off this time, and after halting for a few seconds she felt safe to go on her way once more. If I don't get out soon, I'll faint. But she refused to give in. The thought of lying helpless in one of these tenantless corridors at the mercy of the hidden murderer kept her on her feet. He'd think I was shamming, and he'd make sure of me. The thought of that fate was just sufficient to nerve her to a desperate attempt to extricate herself from the labyrinth, but now her self-control gave way. She began to hurry along the interminable corridors, and before many seconds had passed she had broken into a run. Soon she was flying headlong down the alleys, slipping as she turned corners in full flight, dashing blindly into hedges which blocked her path in cul-de-sac, and striving only to outstrip the phantom murderer whom she felt at her heels. All thought of caution or direction had gone to the winds as she fled at haphazard down the tortuous paths. Just as she felt that she could force herself no farther, a wider gap than usual appeared in one of the green walls, and she flung herself into it in the hope that it might be one of the exits. But instead of the broad lawns of Whistlefield, she found before her a tiny open space shut in on all sides by greenery. A few garden chairs were scattered about it, under the shade of the hedges. One of them had been overturned, and beside it lay, face upwards, the body of a man in grey flannel clothes. Vera had never seen a dead man before, but it needed no second glance to tell her that she had stumbled upon the victim of the tragedy. "It's Roger Shandon." Almost subconsciously she noted that the body showed no visible signs of violence. Roger seemed to have collapsed as he rose from his chair. She could see no pool of blood which might have pointed to the manner of his death. Vera's nerves could withstand the strain no longer. The glimpse of the body proved to be the final touch which was more than she could bear. Almost incuriously she noticed the blue sky darken, turn violet, and then go black. She retreated a couple of paces, only to go down in a faint. When she came to her senses again, it was to hear the sound of her own name in her ears, but when she looked round she could see no one standing beside her. "Vera, are you there? Why don't you answer?" Slowly she came back to normal consciousness and the realization that it was Howard Torrance's voice continually calling. "Vera, answer if you can. What made you shriek like that?" So she must have uttered some involuntary cry before she fainted. She turned this over in her mind mechanically, hardly yet knowing where she was. Then all at once things came back to her as she rose to her knees. Roger Shandon's body was close to her, and she turned away her head so as not to see the dead man. "Vera." She pulled herself together and answered with a faint call. "Thank God you're all right," she heard Howard answer. "Where are you?" "I've come to the center where the body is." "Oh, Howard, what am I to do?" "The murderer's gone, I think," came the reply. "Can you walk at all? Get away from that place at once. No wonder you shrieked when you came upon it. If you'll call as often as you can manage it, I'll try to find my way to you." With an effort she forced herself to her feet once more. Her strength seemed to be almost gone, but by sheer willpower she succeeded in making her way out of the tiny enclosure into the green corridor. Anything to get away from the sight of the body. It was too grim a reminder of the perils of the maze. For a time she leaned against the hedge just outside the center, trying to gather up enough energy to launch once more into the labyrinth. One horror had at least been banished. Howard said the murderer had escaped from the maze. She need have no fear of meeting that demon in her wanderings. It seemed hours since she and Howard had come so light-heartedly into that Daedalian web. She had no idea how long she had been unconscious, and when she looked back, she seemed to have spent an eternity in the paths of the maze before she had blundered into the center. At last she pulled herself together and called again to Howard. "Howard, I'm going to try for the way out now." "All right. Give me a call occasionally, so that I'll know you're all right. By the way, why don't you blow the horn?" "I've lost it. I dropped it when I thought the murderer was chasing me." "I wondered why you didn't use it, after I'd told you he'd cleared out. Shouting's no good. I've been yelling at the pitch of my voice for long enough, but there's no one within earshot, evidently." Vera set off again. The rest had done her good. Now that the immediate terror of the murderer in the maze was removed, she felt a different person. The horror through which she had passed began somehow to take on a tinge of unreality. Had she actually seen Roger Shandon's body lying on the grass, or had it been a mere hallucination sweeping over her when she was on the verge of fainting? She had the feeling that the whole thing might be some walking nightmare which had passed. And now, by that curious hazard which sometimes happens in mazes, she hit upon the shortest route to the exit. When she was least expecting it, a sudden turn in the corridor revealed one of the iron gates in the outermost hedge. "Howard. I've come to the gate. What a relief." "Wait before you go," Howard's voice came to her over the intervening partitions. "Listen to me. Once you get outside, run to the house. If you meet anyone on the way, send him down to get me out of this tangle. I seem to have no luck. When you get to the house, find Stenness or one of the other men. Send the lot, if they're there. Tell them about the murder and tell them to get the police on the phone at once. And get yourself some brandy or something. You'll need it, poor thing." Vera made a careful note of his orders. "I'll see to that. I'm going now, Howard. Goodbye." She ran out of the iron gate and saw with immense relief the broad prospect of the lawns before her. Out at last. Then she hurried off in the direction of the house. Chapter 3. The immediate results. As she took short cuts across the lawns, Vera kept a sharp lookout, but no one was in sight. She had expected this, for if anyone had been in the vicinity of the maze they would assuredly have been attracted by Howard's shouts for assistance. She wasted no time in seeking in the gardens for help, but hurried at her best speed to the house, where she could at least get in touch with the police by means of the telephone. When, breathless with the last spurt she had made, she entered the hall, she found it empty. The whole place seemed deserted and silent. For a moment she thought of searching from room to room, but she changed her mind almost immediately. "I must keep my head," she impressed on herself. "I know nothing about the servants' quarters, and I'd lose time if I begin hunting. That last sprint took it out of me, and I'm not fit to rush about. Someone else must do that instead." She passed into the nearest room and rang the bell, keeping her finger pressed down on the button. That ought to bring them quick enough. In a few moments she heard steps, and one of the maids appeared. The sight of her amazed face reminded Vera of the picture she herself must present, disheveled, breathless, and without shoes on her feet. "Are there any men in the house, Shelton? Quick, don't waste time." The maid stared at the haggard girl before her as though in this strange figure she could hardly recognize the cool and graceful Miss Forrest of normal life. "What's come to you, miss?" she asked, without replying to the question. "Mr. Shandon's been murdered. Is Mr. Stenness here, or Mr. Hawkhurst? Or anyone else? Go and find them immediately, if they're anywhere about." Then, as the girl still seemed dazed by the news, "Can't you do as I tell you? Hurry. There's no time to lose." A picture rose in her mind of the murderer returning to the maze and coming upon the defenseless Howard. Unlikely, of course, but after this afternoon she would be slow to call anything unlikely. The maid's slowness irritated her overwrought nerves. "Will you go?" But by this time the idea of murder had penetrated the dull mind of Shelton and produced a reaction which Vera had not foreseen. Mr. Shandon murdered, and the man creeping about the place. "I'd never dare to go out of this room, miss. He might be in the hall now, waiting for me. Oh, oh." Her voice rose in hysteria. Vera looked at her wearily. "Want to scream, Shelton? Perhaps it's the easiest way after all. I'd have done it myself if I'd had any breath left. Come along with me." And taking the hysterical girl with her, she made her way to the front door. "Now scream as loud as you like." Shelton had not waited for the suggestion. Already she was shrieking at the top of her voice. "Anybody in the house or near it ought to hear that," Vera said to herself contentedly, as Shelton continued to screech. "Now, that'll do. Will you be quiet? I want to listen if anyone has heard you." It proved more difficult to stop the outcry than it had been to start it. The screams passed into a serious attack of hysteria. But they had served their purpose. From the back of the house appeared two panic-stricken maids, while almost simultaneously Stenness, the secretary, hurried down the main staircase. "Thank goodness, a man at last." Vera said, in relief. Handing over the hysterical Shelton to the care of the other maids, she led Stenness into the nearest room and gave him the state of affairs in the fewest words. He listened intently without interrupting her with a single question. From his unruffled manner, one might have supposed that murders were all in the day's work. And his calmness had the effect of soothing Vera's nerves, which had been jarred afresh by the maid's outbreak. When she had completed her narrative, he nodded in comprehension and left the room for a few moments. On his return, he had a tumbler in his hand. "Drink this, Miss Forrest. You'll need something to pull you together. I've sent one of the maids to ring the bell in the stableyard. That'll bring up a couple of gardeners fairly soon. They'll think it's a fire, you know." He persuaded her to sit down, then went to the bell and rang it. It was some time before any answer was made, and finally Shelton and another maid appeared together, evidently clinging to each other for company. "Go up and get fresh shoes and stockings for Miss Forrest. Can't you see she needs them?" When the two girls had gone, he turned to Vera. "Nothing like making them do something, otherwise we'd have the whole lot down with their nerves." He glanced at his wristwatch, and seemed to be making some rather intricate mental calculation which dissatisfied him. "You'll be safe enough here, Miss Forrest. I must get off to telephone for the police and put them on the alert. Then I'll go down and get Mr. Torrance out of the maze. You want nothing else?" Vera made a negative gesture, and he hurried out of the room. The telephone occupied him for only a very short time, and in a few minutes Vera, through the window, saw him setting off in the direction of the maze, accompanied by one of the gardeners. Both, she noticed, were armed with shotguns. She began to admire the efficiency of Stenness. Hitherto she had looked upon him as the sort of man whose life was spent in pure routine, and it was a mild surprise to find how competently he had risen to this emergency. He had wasted neither words nor time, everything essential had been done without hesitation. He had even noticed her feet and had thought of sending for shoes and stockings for her. When the maids brought her fresh outfit, she took the opportunity of questioning them. "Was Mr. Stenness the only man in the house when I came back?" "Yes, miss. Miss Sylvia took her uncle away with her in the car, Mr. Ernest, I mean. And Mr. Neville went out of the house before poor Mr. Shandon did. And Mr. Hawkhurst, he went out quite early on. I saw him passing the window with his air gun in his hand." Vera had ceased to listen. The word air gun had linked up in her mind with the memory of the dull concussions which she had heard in the maze. That was the noise she had heard, the dull report of an air rifle. And the metallic rasping was the grating of the spring as the murderer recharged his weapon. But the recognition of the noises left her even more perplexed. Of course, one can kill a rabbit with an air gun, but one couldn't kill a man with it even at close range. And yet I'm certain it was an air gun that I heard. I'd have recognized it at once if it hadn't been that I was so shaken up by the way things happened. She puzzled over the problem for a time without success, and at last dismissed it from her mind and began to make arrangements which she thought might be necessary when the men returned to the house. Meanwhile Stenness, accompanied by the gardener, had made his way to the maze. As they came in sight of it, they saw the figure of Howard Torrance emerge from one of the entrances and gaze in their direction. Recognizing the secretary, he came rapidly towards them. "Seen Miss Forrest, Stenness?" he demanded as soon as he reached speaking distance. "Is she all right?" "She fetched us," Stenness explained. "She's completely done in, of course. That's natural. But I don't think she'll come to any harm. I left 2 maids with her, just in case, though it looked more as if the maids would collapse before she did." Howard nodded without replying, and Stenness continued. "We'd better get into the maze now and stand guard over the body till the police turn up. They'll be here shortly." Howard hesitated a moment. "Sure you know how to get about in that maze, Stenness? You won't get tangled up? Got bogged in it myself once already. No desire to have another dose, you know." "There's no danger of that. Both Skeen and I know every inch of it. He cuts the hedges." This seemed to allay Howard's doubts, and he led the way to the entrance. But here Stenness displaced him. "I'll take the lead, I think. I know the path. Besides, one never can tell. Somebody may be in there yet." He tapped his shotgun in explanation of his full meaning, and Howard acquiesced. "Right. In you go." They entered the labyrinth, Stenness in advance with his gun ready, Howard and the armed gardener bringing up the rear. For a minute or two they walked in silence along the intricate corridors, Stenness taking turning after turning without the slightest hesitation. "I wish I had had the thing by heart as he seems to have," Howard reflected, as he noted the easy way in which the secretary seemed to hold to his route. It would have been a different business, then. All at once, Stenness halted abruptly and made a gesture of caution to his companions. His quick ears had caught something which they had missed. "There's somebody moving in the next corridor," he whispered. "Wait here. I'll fix him." With his gun ready, he stepped suddenly round the corner of the alley and immediately they heard his curt command. "Hands up." When they in turn had rounded the corner, they found the secretary covering with his shotgun an unattractive stranger. The reddish hair, the ugly mouth, made worse by a ragged and untidy moustache, the peculiar vulpine expression, and the flashy clothes, all combined to produce a bad impression even at the first glance. As he stood, hands in air, in front of Stenness's gun, his eyes wandered from one face to another with something of the expression of a rat at bay. "Run over this fellow, Torrance," said the secretary. "He may be armed." Howard searched the man methodically and extracted from one pocket a heavy automatic pistol. Beyond that, the man had no other weapon. "See if it's been fired," suggested Stenness. "Fully loaded, and hasn't been fired," Howard reported. "Good. Now, my man, how do you come to be here?" "I was rowing on the river, and as I was coming near here, I heard someone yelling blue murder, so I came up." "What would you have done, eh?" "Kept away, I expect. Then I came inside this monkey puzzle to give a hand. And I've stuck here ever since." "That satisfy you?" "Nothing to do with me. The police will be here shortly. You can explain to them. Meanwhile, you'll come along with us. Skeen, take charge of this fellow. If he tries to run, empty your gun into his legs. Now come along." Again taking the van, Stenness continued on his way, and in a very short time he brought them to one of the centers of the maze. Howard Torrance followed him into the tiny precinct, but his first glance led him to protest. "This isn't the place where I found the body. It must be in the other center." Stenness's shoulders blocked the view for a moment, but almost at once he stepped aside. "There's a body here, at any rate," he said, going forward as he spoke. "It's Roger Shandon." "Roger!" exclaimed Howard in blank surprise. "It was Neville Shandon's body that I found." "Then they've both been murdered," Stenness pointed out coldly. "That's obvious." "But what I heard sounded like a single attack," protested Howard. Stenness shrugged his shoulders. "That's for the police to explain," he said. "No use barking yourself when you keep a dog." He went forward and covered the face of the body with his handkerchief. "It's Roger, obviously, and stone dead. Nothing more to do here. Let's try the other center next. Skeen, you needn't come. Keep your eye on this fellow till we come back." He led Howard through the alleys once more, and in a short time they entered the second center of the maze. "This is Neville Shandon, true enough," the secretary reported. The identification had taken longer, since the body lay on its face. "Mustn't disturb anything, Torrance. The police may be able to make something out of it if we leave things alone." He rose from his knees and mechanically dusted his trousers as he spoke. Howard was struck by the extraordinary matter-of-fact way in which Stenness had treated the whole affair. One might have expected some sign of emotion, surprise at the very least, but Stenness had gone through the whole business without showing the slightest disturbance. But as Howard reflected on the matter, he was forced to admit that, after all, it was much what one might have anticipated. Stenness, he remembered, had always been chary of showing any emotion whatever. Probably this was just a case of carrying the normal to an extreme where it became noticeable. Stenness, doubtless, took a pride in that mask of coolness. The secretary stooped for a moment over Neville Shandon's body and examined the left hand which lay clenched on the grass. "There's a piece of paper there. It looks as if it had been wrenched out of his hand and a scrap left in his grip. Let's see what one can make of it without touching it." He knelt down and scrutinized the fragment painfully. "Some of his notes on the Hackleton case, perhaps. I can read Hackle on it plain enough." Howard did not trouble to look at the paper at close range. "What do you make of it?" he demanded, as the secretary rose to his feet again. Nothing much. It might be someone trying to put Neville Shandon out of business while the Hackleton case is on. That might account for the notes being taken. Or it might be someone with a grudge against Roger. He had some enemies. A threatening letter came from a man only the other day. Howard digested these suggestions for a few moments without speaking, then he offered an objection. "But do you think it's likely that two murderers would choose an identical moment for their attacks? Two simultaneous crimes is a bit of a record, it seems to me." "Think so?" the secretary responded, carelessly. "It's happened this time, for all that." Howard had to admit the truth of this. Stenness looked at his watch. "I must be getting off to the outside of the maze. The police will be here very soon, and they'll need a guide. I'll take you back to Skene, if you like." Howard nodded assent, and once more Stenness led the way through a tangle of alleys. "Here's Helen's bower," he said, nodding towards its entrance. "You can sit down there till I bring the police." Howard watched his figure disappear round a corner of the corridor and then turned his steps to the entrance of the little enclosure where Roger Shandon's body lay. As he entered it, he was surprised to see Skene on his knees at the foot of the hedge, evidently collecting some small objects. "What are you after, Skene?" he demanded. "I thought you were supposed to be watching this fellow." Skene rose to his feet, rather sulky at being reproved. "He ain't escaped yet. I'm 'tween him and the door." Howard acknowledged the truth of both statements. "What are you grubbing in the hedge for?" he continued, after he had made his apology. Skene extended an earthy palm on which rested some small objects. "'Tis the lid of a tin box, one of these round uns. And here's some darts that Mr. Hawkhurst uses for that air gun of his when he's shootin' at a target. Let's see. 1, 2, 3. He laboriously counted up to 7 and held out his hand for confirmation. "Put 'em in the box lid, Skene, and lay 'em down somewhere safe. You found them where I saw you searching." "Just in there, among the roots of the hedge. Like enough the other bit of the box'll be outside in the alley. I'll have a look." "Don't bother, Skene. We mustn't disturb anything till the police get here, you know. If there's anything more, they'll prefer to hunt for it themselves. What you've got to remember is that you found these 7 things, 7, remember, at that point in the hedge. Better mark it with a stick or something, so that you'll know the exact spot again." The sight of the darts had put a thought into his mind. He went over to Roger Shandon's body and examined it carefully. But so far as the exposed portions were concerned, he found no trace of the thing for which he was searching, and he did not care to take the responsibility of altering the posture of the corpse. As he rose to his feet once more, he heard the note of a motor horn in the distance. "The police, I expect," he said to Skene. "They'll be here in a minute or two. Mr. Stenness has gone to lead them in through the maze." Chapter 4. The Chief Constable. As Stenness picked his way through the convolutions of the maze, his face showed that his mind was at work on some puzzling problem. "Things haven't worked out quite according to plan," he commented to himself as he walked along. "I've missed that train, now, and I may as well see the business through on the spot. If only I'd aimed for the earlier train, I might have pulled it off." His frown of annoyance faded out suddenly, as a new idea crossed his mind. "Perhaps it's all for the best after all. I never thought of that point. Nobody can swear to it, and it leaves me absolutely on velvet, safer than ever. His face cleared completely as he considered the fresh situation which had presented itself. This is worth a dozen of the other notion. All I have to do now is to sit tight and keep a straight face. The secretary soon reached the outskirts of the maze. Then, taking up a position which commanded the road to the east gate, he sat down on the grass and waited the arrival of the police. Before long, a motor horn sounded, and he rose to his feet as a big car came tearing up the narrow private road. In the front seats were 2 civilians, whilst the back held 3 uniformed policemen. Long before the motor reached him, Stenness had recognized the man at the wheel as the owner of a neighboring estate. "That's Wendover of Talgarth Grange. I wonder what he's doing here." Going out into the roadway, the secretary signalled them to stop and the long car drew up as it came level with him. Wendover jumped down from the driving seat and came forward while the others were getting out of the motor. "Sad business, this, Stenness. Terrible affair. Is poor Shandon really dead? Why, I saw him yesterday, poor chap." Stenness was watching the remainder of the party, and he noticed that there had been a dog in the car. It was now fawning on the second civilian, evidently delighted to get out of its cramped quarters in the motor. Stenness turned back to his interlocutor. "It's worse than we supposed when I telephoned. 2 of the Shandons have been murdered in the maze, here." He nodded in the direction of the high green hedges. Wendover was completely taken aback. "2 of them? My godfathers. Here, Clinton." He called to the second civilian. "Terrible business, this. There's been a second murder." Then, as the man with the dog came up to them, Wendover turned back to the secretary. "This is the Chief Constable, Sir Clinton Driffield. Clinton, this is Mr. Stenness, secretary to Roger Shandon." Stenness examined the Chief Constable with what seemed more than common interest. Sir Clinton was a slight man who looked about 35. His sun-tanned face, the firm mouth under the close-clipped moustache, the beautifully kept teeth and hands, might have attracted a second glance in a crowd, but to counter this there was deliberate ordinariness about his appearance. Had a stranger, meeting him casually, been asked later on to describe him, it would have been difficult, for Sir Clinton designedly refrained from anything characteristic in his dress. Only his eyes failed to fit in with the rest of his conventional appearance, and even them he had disciplined as far as possible. Normally, they had a bored expression, but at times the mask slipped aside and betrayed the activity of the brain behind them. When fixed on a man they gave a curious impression as though they saw, not the physical exterior of the subject, but instead the real personality concealed below the facial lineaments. "A second case? You seem to be starting a wholesale trade at Whistlefield, Mr. Stenness." Stenness was not impressed by the cheerfulness of the tone. He had felt those keen eyes sweep over him, and though it had been anything but a stare, he had the sensation of being appraised and catalogued for future reference. He disliked the turn of the Chief Constable's phrase, too. Whether intentionally or not, it seemed to verge on the macabre. "What about starting, eh?" Wendover demanded. "Get on the track while the scent's hot, Clinton. Every minute may count, you know." Sir Clinton assented with a nod and snapped his fingers to call his dog to heel. "Suppose you show us the bodies, Mr. Stenness." Without replying, Stenness led the way into the maze, followed closely by the whole party. The Chief Constable scanned the corridors as he passed along, but made no comment. Wendover evidently felt that some explanation of his presence was due, for as they traversed the alleys he overtook the secretary. "Curious coincidence, this, Stenness. Sir Clinton's a friend of mine, and he happened to be staying with me just now for a few days. Most fortunate affair. When you phoned down to the police station, they rang him up at once at the Grange. I got out the car, of course, and we picked up the constables at the station as we passed. Couldn't have been better planned, could it?" Then, passing to a new line of thought, he added, "Terrible affair for the family. Dreadful business. It'll be a frightful shock for Miss Hawkhurst, won't it?" Before Stenness could reply, they came to the entrance of one of the centres of the maze. The secretary turned to the Chief Constable. This is what they call the Pool of Narcissus, Sir Clinton. We found Neville Shandon's body here. Roger Shandon's body is lying in the other center of the maze. Sir Clinton nodded without replying, took off his hat, and entered the enclosure. The body lay just as Stenness had seen it last, and the chief constable made no attempt to touch it, though he subjected it to a most minute inspection. "I forgot to tell you," whispered Wendover. "We phoned for a doctor to come and examine the body. He'll be here very soon." The chief constable rose lightly to his feet. 2 or 3 small wounds, apparently, but not much bleeding. Once the doctors overhauled him, we can make a fuller examination. In the meantime, things had better be left as they are. Will you take us to the other body now, Mr. Stenness? Leaving one of the constables on guard over the corpse, the party made its way, under Stenness's guidance, to the second center of the maze. On the road, Wendover gave Stenness some further information. "Most fortunate that Driffield was on the spot, wasn't it? He'll get to the bottom of things quick enough, trust him for that. He used to be out in South Africa, a big post in the police there. Then he came home for family reasons and dropped into the chief constableship here. Much too good a man for the place, you know, but it gives him enough to keep him busy. By the way, he knew something about Roger Shandon out at the Cape. I believe Shandon made part of his money there," Stenness volunteered in confirmation. As they entered Helen's bower, Stenness saw a momentary upward twitch of Sir Clinton's eyebrows as his glance lighted on the stranger whom they had encountered in the maze. "Ah, Mr. Timothy Costock?" The captive showed much more surprise. "Why, it's Driffield, so it is. Well, if that isn't the damnedest luck. There's no keeping out of the way you busies, it seems. But you're on the wrong track this shot. I never laid a finger on this fellow." He indicated Roger Shandon's body as he spoke. "Nobody's accused you of laying a finger on him. Or of anything else, yet," said Sir Clinton, curtly. "I'll listen to your story later on, don't waste time elaborating it. You'll find the plain truths best. This is more serious than illicit diamond buying." He paused for an instant, then continued. "Now I think of it, you were Shandon's cat's paw that time I got my hands on you at Kimberley." Then, as Costock opened his mouth in protest, Sir Clinton cut him short abruptly. "I'd keep my mouth shut, if I were you. Nobody's asking you to incriminate yourself." The hint was sufficient for the ex-I.D.B. expert. His protest died on his lips. Sir Clinton paid no further attention to him, but set about a careful examination of the body of Roger Shandon. As he rose to his feet again, Stenness came forward. "This is Mr. Howard Torrance, Sir Clinton, a guest at the house. He was in the maze at the moment when the murder was done. Torrance, this is the chief constable." He turned to the gardener. "This is Skene, Sir Clinton, one of the gardeners on the estate. He came with me here as soon as we learned what had happened." Sir Clinton nodded a brief appreciation of Stenness's explanations. The secretary had wasted no words over the business, and yet had given all the information necessary at the moment. Howard Torrance, thus brought to the front, seized the opportunity offered to him. "Some darts here." Skene found them at the foot of the hedge. Lid of a tin box was lying beside them as well. Sir Clinton picked up the lid and inspected the tiny missiles which had been collected. "Air gun darts, evidently," he commented. Characteristically enough, he did not call attention to the equally obvious fact that they were not ordinary air gun darts. The woolen feathering, instead of showing the usual gaudy colors, was stained brown, and a rusty powder seemed to cling to the fiber. A tiny patch of the same pigment showed on the metal jackets of the darts, near the points. Sir Clinton put the collection down again carefully. "Now, Skene," he said, turning to the gardener, "that was a good piece of work of yours. Can you show me exactly where you found these things?" Obviously delighted with the chief constable's compliment, Skene was only too ready to indicate the precise position where he had picked up the darts and the box lid. "You got the lot, I suppose? At least all you could see from here?" Howard Torrance, Watching the chief constable, was surprised to see that his eyes, instead of searching the ground, seemed to be ranging over the surface of the hedge, and when Skene answered the question, Sir Clinton's thoughts appeared to be elsewhere. He turned to Stenness. "Can you take us to the other side of this hedge at that point?" Stenness led the way once more into the maze, and Sir Clinton found that quite a considerable distance had to be traversed before they reached the required position. "This is the place?" he inquired, as Stenness came to a halt. "That's clear enough," he added, as he stooped to pick something from the side of the path. When he held it out, they recognized it as the bottom of the tin box of which the lid had already been found. Sir Clinton turned to the constables. "Hunt about and see if you can find any more of these darts. You mustn't miss a single one, remember. And handle them carefully. They're deadly things, evidently." Then, as Stenness and Howard Torrance showed signs of joining in the search, the chief constable stopped them with a gesture. "I think we'll leave the officials to do the work," he said with a certain finality in his tone. Again he appeared to be more interested in the hedge itself than in the roots where more darts might be hidden, and after a moment or two he went forward and seemed to peer closely into the greenery at one particular point. When he stepped back again, Howard moved forward in curiosity, and Sir Clinton made way for him. As he brought his eye to the position in which he had seen the chief constables, he looked into a concealed loophole. The twigs had been trimmed away to form a tunnel, the ends of which had been left covered with a thin screen of leafage, and a glance through the aperture showed that it bore directly on the chair in which Roger Shandon had been killed. But already Sir Clinton seemed to have lost interest in the matter. He whistled, and the dog which had been left behind in Helen's bower came running to him. "Have a sniff," he invited the animal, holding out to it the part of the tin box which he still held in his hand. "Now see what you can make of it." He turned to his companions. "It's a poor chance. Don't blame the animal if it fails." Part of Sir Clinton's character was revealed in the whimsical apology. He was always noted for his loyalty to his subordinates and his readiness to recognize the impossibility of some tasks. It was the complement to his sternness when he had to deal with inefficiency. "That's right. Good dog. He's on to something," Wendover announced unnecessarily. The beast had apparently picked up some scent or other, for it hurried off along the alleys, followed by Sir Clinton and the other 3 men. The constables were left to their search among the hedge roots. It was anything but a simple route along which the dog led them, for it seemed to wind backwards and forwards almost at haphazard. "Nobody who knew the maze would have tried to get out this way," Stenness commented at last. His remark was hardly needed, for already the dog had more than once halted in the middle of an open alley and then retraced its course for no obvious reason. It was Howard Torrance who saw the meaning of these intricate tracings before the remainder of the party. "Of course," he explained. "The murderer didn't go straight out of the maze immediately. Probably he found Miss Forrest and myself blocking the road again and again as we wandered about. And he'd got to avoid being seen by us. That's why he had to turn and wind about like this." At last the dog led them to the edge of the maze, passed out through the iron gate, and went on eagerly across the grass. The track had brought them to the river side of the labyrinth, where a tiny clump of trees had been planted, and into this the dog plunged. A few paces further on it halted for a moment at the foot of a tree. "Perhaps he climbed that," Wendover suggested, going up and examining the trunk. "Look. There's a faint mark here on the trunk, just about the height that a man could reach with his foot." Sir Clinton examined the mark, which was very slight indeed. Then he looked at the dog, which had set off in a fresh direction. "I suppose he must have got tired of the view and come down again. In that case, one usually does come down. One rarely climbs higher than the top." He set off after the dog, which was now making for the road running past the maze. But here it seemed to go astray. It snuffed about with the utmost eagerness, casting wider and wider in its attempt to recapture the scent, but soon it was clear that it had lost the track. Sir Clinton took it back to the tree once more and allowed it to start afresh. This time he followed closely on its track, and his companions noticed that he had pulled some paper from his pocket and was scattering tiny fragments on the grass to mark the animal's route. But this attempt also ended in failure. Beyond the road, the trail seemed to be lost. "We may as well give it up," Sir Clinton admitted. "One can't expect infallibility from a dumb animal." As he called the beast off, a motor horn sounded, and they saw a car coming from the direction of the house. "That's our doctor, I expect," Sir Clinton surmised, and Stenness confirmed the guess. In a few minutes they had all made their way to Helen's bower, under Stenness's guidance. Once there, the doctor proposed to begin his examination of the bodies, but the chief constable intervened. "Just a moment, doctor. Before you shift anything, I want to take 1 or 2 photographs. Nothing like a permanent record for future reference." He took a case which one of the constables had carried and produced from it one of the largest-sized Kodaks. Then, by the marks of the feet in the grass, he replaced the overturned chair in its proper position, and finally he marked the position of the loophole in the hedge by means of a scrap of paper. "I want something to give the scale," he explained, at the last moment. "Would you mind sitting in the chair, Mr. Stenness? And perhaps you'd stand by the loophole, Mr. Torrance?" He looked round the enclosure for an instant. "And here, Costock, you get over into that corner. It'll give some notion of the distance." When they had placed themselves, he took several photographs from various positions. "Now, doctor, you can get to work if you like." The doctor made only a cursory examination. "I think it would be best to shift the body up to the house. The light's not very good here, now the sun's going down. Besides, I'll need to do more than I can do in this place." "There's a second body waiting for you," Sir Clinton explained. "We've the whole thing to do over again." The doctor, a taciturn man, shrugged his shoulders without making any audible comment, and they made their way, guided by Stenness, to the pool of Narcissus. Sir Clinton gave some directions to his constables and dispatched the gardener to the house to bring down something on which the bodies could be carried. Then the photographic procedure was repeated, and the doctor made his examination of Neville Shandon's corpse. "There must be a loophole in this hedge as well," the chief constable mused aloud, "but it's not worthwhile hunting for it at present. It won't run away." The constables reported the discovery of several fresh darts which had fallen either into the hedge itself or among the roots on the outer side. Skene, it appeared, had secured all those on the inner border. Sir Clinton counted the tiny projectiles carefully, dropped them into the tin box, and put the box in his pocket. "That's 11 altogether. Go back and hunt for anything more. I must have every one of these darts if you have to finish the search by lamplight. Make absolutely certain that you miss nothing." Skene arrived shortly afterwards with 2 other gardeners carrying hurdles, and the 2 bodies were transported to the cars and so conveyed to the house. 2 more constables had arrived, and these were put under the guidance of Skene and given instructions to search the whole of the maze for anything suspicious. When the bodies had been taken up to a bedroom, Sir Clinton and the doctor carried out a minute examination. Each victim had been struck by 3 darts. In the case of Neville Shandon, the wounds suggested that the shots had been fired from the front and rather to one side. Roger's body, on the other hand, contained 1 dart embedded in the back of the neck, and 2 in the upper part of the rear surface between the spine and the shoulder on the left side. Beyond the punctures made by the darts, neither victim showed a trace of either wound or struggle. "Poison, obviously," Sir Clinton concluded. The doctor agreed, adding in confirmation. "None of these darts came near a vital spot. Alone, they'd never have killed a man. Can you guess what poison was used?" The doctor shook his head. "Not my line. Some of these Indian arrow poisons, perhaps. Ardsley could tell you something about them, most likely." "Who's Ardsley? Could one get hold of him quickly?" "He lives less than a mile from here. He's a medical, but he doesn't practice. Curiously enough, toxicology is his line, more or less. He's a bit of a physiologist, too. I know he has a vivisection license. You might do worse than look him up. He might be able to give you a hint." Sir Clinton looked thoughtful for a moment. What worries me is that a man can't be in two places at once. I'm going to take over this case myself, and there's enough work on hand in the next hour to keep two men busy. It's time I'm up against at present. The doctor, reflecting on the conflicting calls of a country practice, was inclined to think that Sir Clinton seemed to make a fuss about very little. Chapter 5. The evidence in the case. When the doctor had completed his work and left the room, Sir Clinton pulled a tin box of darts from his pocket and went over to the window to examine it. The box itself suggested nothing in the way of a clue, it was of a common pattern. He turned from it to the darts themselves. That brown stuff on the feathering is evidently the poison, whatever it may be, he reflected. It doesn't seem much of a dose to kill a man, especially if one assumes that it was a quick death. Even ordinary snake poison would hardly do the trick quick enough. And yet these fellows didn't seem to have moved much after they were hit, to judge by the look of the ground. He took a Coddington lens from his pocket and scanned one of the darts carefully, then with a pin he probed a dark spot near the point of the projectile. So that's it. He's drilled a hole clean through the metal and filled up the hollow with poison. That would mean a fair quantity driven well home under the skin, and the blood would soon wash the stuff out of the cavity, since both ends are open. An ingenious devil, evidently. He thoughtfully replaced the dart in the box, but before putting the tin back into his pocket he counted the missiles carefully. 11 of them here, and 6 more in the 2 bodies. He glanced at the open box again, trying to estimate its probable capacity. That must have been the lot. The doctor had extracted the 6 fatal darts from the bodies and left them lying on a piece of lint on the dressing table. Sir Clinton rolled them up cautiously, took his cigarette case from his pocket, emptied out the contents, and inserted the packet of darts instead. I'm not likely to get pricked now, short of a big smash. After putting the cigarette case and the tin box containing the darts into his pockets, he left the room and went downstairs. The windows throughout the house had been darkened, but Sir Clinton found his way in the semi-obscurity to Roger Shandon's study, and here he came upon Wendover, the 2 guests, and the secretary. Costock had been left in the hall in charge of a constable. Now, Sir Clinton said, as he sat down, I'm afraid I shall have to trouble you for information. What I want first of all are the plain facts, nothing else. We'll come to suspicions afterwards. Which of you saw the Shandons alive last? I believe I did, the secretary volunteered. At about 10 minutes past 3 this afternoon, Roger Shandon sent one of the maids for me, and I came straight to this room. He gave me some directions about letters. While he was doing this, Neville Shandon looked into the room. He had some papers in his hand. Seeing us engaged, he went away again. That would be about 25 past 3, approximately. Almost immediately after that, Roger Shandon dismissed me, and I noticed him from the window, going towards the maze. That was the last I saw of either of them, till I found their bodies in the maze. Sir Clinton went to the writing table and made a note. You saw Neville Shandon last at about 3:25 p.m., and Roger at, say, 3:30 p.m.? As near as I can gauge the times, Stenness confirmed. Sir Clinton considered for a moment. I judged that it would take a man walking at an ordinary pace at least 10 minutes, say 11 or 12, to reach the maze from the house. That means that Neville Shandon could have reached the maze at 3:37, and Roger might have got there at 3:42. But possibly they were some minutes later than that, and quite possibly, also, they may have arrived in a different order, since no one seems to have seen them actually enter the maze, so far as we have gone with the story. The secretary indicated assent to this with a nod. Sir Clinton turned next to Torrance. I take it that you can carry our information further? Howard Torrance gave his version of the events up to the moment when he discovered the body of Neville Shandon in the enclosure by the pool of Narcissus. Exact times are what we want, Sir Clinton reminded him when he had completed his narrative. Can't give you anything except 2. I happened to look at my watch while Miss Forrest and I were sitting under the trees. It was some time after 3, then, I think it was 20 past 3, but I couldn't swear to it. I took the time when I found Neville Shandon's body. It was 3.52. I could swear to that, for I particularly noted it, knowing it might be wanted. Sir Clinton jotted down these figures also. Now, Miss Forrest, I know you've had a very trying time. I don't want to worry you unnecessarily, but it's essential to get your evidence as to what happened in the maze. Take your time, and don't let yourself get excited. It's all over now. Vera gave him her account, to which he listened without putting any questions until she had finished. Thanks very much, Miss Forrest. There's just one point. You heard steps in the maze several times, a man running at one period and going on tiptoe at other times. You're sure of that? Quite sure. I'm not likely to forget it soon. I can quite understand that, said Sir Clinton, soothingly, for the girl was evidently affected by the mere remembrance of what she had gone through. I'm merely asking these questions to make sure of my ground, you know. You couldn't have mistaken Mr. Torrance's footsteps for those of the murderer by any chance? At this question, the secretary's face showed a gleam of enlightenment, as though he had detected a point which he had previously missed. He glanced at Howard Torrance for an instant as though trying to read his face, then he looked again at the girl. I hadn't thought of that, Vera admitted frankly. But I don't think I did. You heard Mr. Torrance's voice from time to time, Sir Clinton continued. I'm trying to suggest that he may have called from a distance at the same time as you heard the steps near at hand. You see, it's essential to find out exactly when the murderer left the maze if possible, and we can only do that by checking his movements in the maze. Vera thought for a moment or two before she replied. I can't recall it. You know, Sir Clinton, I was nearly out of my mind with panic. I didn't take note of things. I couldn't. And there's another thing, I did notice that I couldn't make out the directions from which sounds came. The maze seemed to shift them about anyhow. I really couldn't tell where Mr. Torrance was at any time when he shouted to me. Sir Clinton nodded. I'd rather have you say that than try to strain your memory to make things fit. Now, just to make sure, you really did hear the murderer's steps, or at any rate some steps, quite close to you, on the other side of the hedge, once. And that was before you found Roger Shandon's body. Vera nodded assent to both questions. To her relief, Sir Clinton turned to Stenness. Did you note the time when Miss Forrest got back to the house again? I looked at my watch when she was telling me her story. It was then 4.42. I reached the maze myself at 5.16. You were in your own room upstairs when Miss Forrest came to the house? Yes. My room is at the back, so I could not have seen her coming in, even if I'd been looking out of my window. My first warning of the whole affair was when the maid began to scream. Sir Clinton added a jotting to his notes, then he turned to the company with a relaxation of his official air. These are the facts, then, the things you could swear to in the witness box. I take it that you've told me all that's relevant. But, candidly, these facts don't take us far. The police don't profess to know the details of people's private lives, but when an affair of this sort crops up we have to poke our noses in, whether we like it or not. Hitherto we've kept to the facts, but now I'd like, if possible, to get your personal views of the meaning of the facts. You probably have intimate knowledge of affairs at Whistlefield which I haven't got. Does it suggest anything to you in connection with this case? He glanced from face to face without putting a direct question to any of his hearers. Vera Forrest was the first to speak. I know almost as little as you do yourself, Sir Clinton. I'm a friend of Sylvia, of course, but I know no more about her uncle's affairs than a casual visitor might pick up in a few days' stay at the house. The whole thing is an absolute mystery so far as I'm concerned. Howard Torrance had the same story to tell. I'm in much the same state as Miss Forrest. Neville Shandon I met for the first time a few days ago. Roger was only a casual acquaintance, and I never felt inclined to force myself into his intimacy. I'm really a guest of Miss Hawkhurst, just as Miss Forrest is. Sir Clinton turned to the secretary. You've perhaps had better opportunities, Mr. Stenness? The secretary admitted this with a nod. I've been secretary to Mr. Roger Shandon for the last 2 years, nearly 3. Do you expect me to divulge anything about his private affairs? Anything that seems useful. It can't hurt him now. Then I needn't conceal that from time to time he received threatening letters. The last one came only a few days ago. It was written by this man Costock, who's outside in the hall. I can produce it if necessary. Sir Clinton contented himself with saying, I know something about Costock's career. He looked at Stenness as though he expected more, but the secretary seemed to have nothing to add on that subject. Perhaps you could tell us about the relations between the various members of the family. That must have come under your notice, Sir Clinton suggested. Stenness considered for a moment as though arranging his facts. The three brothers always seemed to me to be on good enough terms. I never noticed any ill feeling amongst them. Neville was rather a bully, in his manner, I mean. He always treated one as if one were a hostile witness, but probably that was just a mannerism. Roger was hot-tempered at times. He didn't hit it off with his nephew somehow. But as far as I saw, the feeling was all on one side. Young Hawkhurst seems a harmless boy, rather moody since he had that attack of sleepy sickness. Sir Clinton seemed to prick up his ears at the words. He had sleepy sickness, had he? Any ill effects? Nothing that one could see, except this instability, moodiness, or whatever you like to call it. Very cheery one day and rather depressed soon afterwards, I noticed at times. Sir Clinton did not pursue the subject. Have you heard of any ill feeling locally? He asked. I mean friction with the maids, or the gardeners, or the neighbours. Stenness racked his memory for a moment or two. No, nothing that I can recall. There was some slight disagreement with Dr. Ardsley over fishing rights not long ago, and a few angry letters passed between him and Roger Shandon. But it wasn't an important matter, rather a squabble, but nothing to leave real ill feeling. Do you know anything about money matters? They were both well off? Neville was believed to make enormous fees in some cases. Roger, I know, had plenty of money. He often sent me to cash-bearer checks on his account, and some of them ran into thousands. And he took cash for these? Rather unusual. My impression was that he gambled a good deal, roulette and that sort of thing, for high stakes. I've often paid in large sums in notes on his behalf. Sir Clinton seemed to make a mental note of this. Now what about the third brother, Ernest, I think his name is? A faint expression of contempt crossed Stenness's face at the mention of Ernest's name. He's not like his brothers. Then the disdain of the efficient man for his inefficient fellow broke out. He seems never to have done anything, so far as I know. His brothers kept him going. He spends his time loafing about, fishing, shooting, or just hanging round. It was his fishing, as a matter of fact, that led to the row with Dr. Ardsley. Sir Clinton leaned forward in his chair and looked at the secretary keenly. All this is very interesting, Mr. Stenness, but I have an idea that there's something in your mind that you haven't told us. What is it? The secretary gave him look for look before replying. I don't think this is a local affair at all. The evidence points away from that, entirely. Ah. Now this is what I really wanted, Mr. Stenness. Thus encouraged, Stenness wasted no time. When Neville Shandon looked into the room before going to the maze, he had a sheaf of papers in his hand. When I examined his body, I noticed a scrap of paper, a torn bit. I could read Hackle on it in Neville's writing, and a few other words as well. That's quite correct, interrupted Sir Clinton. I have it in my pocketbook. And you infer? I infer that that scrap is all that remains of his notes for his cross-examination of Hackleton, which was to come off this week. In other words, you think someone in Hackleton's pay is the murderer, and the intention was to put Neville Shandon out of the case finally? That's your statement, not mine, said Stenness, suddenly becoming cautious, but it's been done before now. Sir Clinton nodded. You're thinking of the shooting of Loborie in the Dreyfus case, I suppose? That would be a parallel case to the one you sketched. And the notes might be useful to Hackleton's side as showing the probable line of attack beforehand? Stenness maintained his caution. That's your suggestion, not mine. But assuming that, demanded Sir Clinton. Why was Roger Shandon murdered at all? He had nothing to do with the case. Stenness had his answer ready. Assume that twin brothers resemble each other closely and even dress alike. Mightn't a stranger mistake one for the other and kill him? Obviously. And then he might find that he'd made an error if the second brother turned up. The second man is the man he's been paid to put out of the way. Wouldn't he finish his job? That's an ingenious theory, Mr. Stenness, commented Sir Clinton, but he refrained from saying anything further. Howard Torrance had listened carefully. Hardly think that'll fit, though. Neville was dead when I came across him, and I'd just heard Roger shouting. At least. At any rate, he stumbled for a moment, then recanted. No, you may be right. I was confusing the order of finding the bodies with the order of the murders. There's no proof of the order of the murders, Stenness pointed out. Both of them were dead when they were found, and that's all we know. At this moment steps sounded outside, the door opened noisily, and Sir Clinton saw a stranger enter the room. At the sight of the air gun in the newcomer's hand, Vera Forrest gave a slight exclamation. This is Sir Clinton Driffield, Mr. Hawkhurst, Stenness hastened to explain. The Chief Constable. Arthur Hawkhurst leaned his air gun against the wall and came forward. Do you usually travel with an escort, sir? He inquired with a boyish grin. A bobby and a plainclothes man in the hall outside, I see. Then, turning to Stenness, he went on. Uncle Roger anywhere about? I owe the old man an apology. He's rather peevish with me over the piano, you know, and I must smooth him down. Not let the sun go down on his wrath, etc. Stenness threw an interrogative glance at Sir Clinton. Getting the answer he expected, he broke the news to Arthur. What? Both of them killed? Nonsense. Then the sight of the Chief Constable and the recollection of the uniformed man outside seemed to convince him. Of course. That accounts for the bobby. And they're both gone, you say? Poor old birds. Poor old birds. It was hardly the requiem which might have been expected, but it seemed sincere enough in tone if not in words. He added thoughtfully, and now I'll never get that apology off my chest, after brooding over it all afternoon. I owed him that. Sir Clinton crossed the room and picked up the air gun. This seems pretty strong. Can you kill anything with it? Arthur's grief seemed to pass away with the opening up of a fresh subject. I was out with it in the spinney this afternoon, potting rabbits. It makes less noise than a rook rifle. Scares the bunnies less when you fire. But I only got a couple of brace in the whole afternoon. Sir Clinton made no reply. He tried the spring of the air gun, looked to see that the weapon was unloaded, and then pulled the trigger. For a weapon of its size the report was not loud. He was about to try it a second time when his ear was caught by a sound of limping footsteps in the passage. Again the door of the room opened, and Sir Clinton hastily put the gun back against the wall. Ernest Shandon shuffled into the room and blinked round the assembled group in dull surprise. I've had a devil of a time, he said grumpily. I've been walking miles with a nail in my boot. Stenness stepped into the breach once more and explained the state of affairs. At first, Ernest seemed frankly incredulous. This must be a joke of yours, Stenness. What I mean to say is, the thing's impossible. Murders don't happen to people like us, you know. It's the kind of thing one finds among the lower classes. He peered from face to face, as if expecting to see a smile on one of them, but the seriousness of the company at last appeared to bring the truth home to him. You really mean it? He sank into a chair and gazed round the company once more as though dazed by the realization of the tragedy. Both of them? Why, I was talking to them both not 3 hours ago. We were talking about that Shackleton case, or is it Hackleton? I remember Neville asking if I read the newspapers, and Roger. What was it Roger said? Oh, yes, now I remember. Roger was giving Neville a hint that Hackleton might find it worth his while to sandbag him or something like that. I can't think why, but Roger was very strong about that, I remember. And then I went off and left them together. And now you say they're both dead. I can't believe it, Stenness. Why, I was talking to them not 3 hours ago, or even less, it may be, here in this very room. It's unfortunately true, Mr. Shandon, Howard Torrance assured him. I found the body of Mr. Neville Shandon myself. Ernest paid no attention to him. He seemed to be quite thunderstruck, now that the news had penetrated his mind. At last he roused himself sufficiently to ask for some details, to which he listened with a sort of heavy interest. And they were killed by poisoned darts, you say, and I've got a nail in my boot myself. I might get blood poisoning from it, if I'm not careful. I never thought of that till now. Sir Clinton had allowed a decent interval to elapse before entering the conversation, but he now glanced at his watch and put a question. Can you tell us when you last saw your brothers alive, Mr. Shandon? Ernest reflected for some moments as though trying to fix the time. Then he shook his head regretfully. I'd arranged to go in the car with Sylvia, my niece, you know, but she said I was late and she hurried me off to get ready. I was a bit hustled at the last moment. But Sylvia could tell you, most likely. She's always punctual and she'd remember when we left. It was just before I saw Mr. Neville Shandon look in that door that I heard your car leaving, Mr. Shandon, Stenness volunteered. That would be about 10 minutes past 3. Ernest nodded vaguely. I remember she sent me to put my boots on. That reminds me, my foot's very sore. I hope it isn't blood poisoning. Quite regardless of the company, he began to unlace his boot and finally examined a slight tear in his sock. He was busily engaged in feeling inside his boot for the nail before he spoke again. That nail came up just after Sylvia dropped me outside the grounds. I walked on for a bit, but it began to hurt. You know how a nail in your boot hurts? So I sat down for a bit by the roadside, and luckily the postman came along in his cart and gave me a lift after a while, or I don't know what I'd have done. I'd nothing to hammer it flat with, you see. He returned to an inspection of his foot. Sir Clinton glanced at his watch, and even his impassive face showed a trace of impatience. I'm sorry, Mr. Shandon, but I must get some facts from you before I go. It's essential, or I should not trouble you at this time. Ernest looked up with a long-suffering expression. Oh, ask any questions you please. If I can give any information you want, I'll be glad to do it, quite glad. It's a sad affair for me, for all of us. Anything I can do, of course. By the way, do you mind if I ring for tea? I've had nothing since lunchtime and I feel a bit tired. One misses one's tea. It would brighten me up, I think. Quite oblivious of the astonishment of the company, he rang the bell and gave his order. Now, Mr. Shandon, perhaps you'll give me your attention. I understand that your family consisted of yourself, your 2 brothers, and the late Mrs. Hawkhurst, your sister. Am I right, or have you any relations except your nephew and niece? Ernest blinked for a moment or two as if considering. Nobody nearer than a second cousin once removed. At least, I think that's what you call it. She's the daughter of a second cousin. Lives in Bath, I think. Another point, continued Sir Clinton. Can you tell me if anyone could get the opportunity of learning the maze without being noticed? The gardeners know the paths, of course, but can you think of anyone else? Ernest again blinked for some seconds while he thought over the matter. Ardsley took an interest in it at one time, that was before he made such a fuss over the fishing. He hasn't been here since that row. Not that I bore any grudge over it, you understand, far from it. One may differ from a man without letting bad feeling come in, I always think, don't you? Sir Clinton refused to follow him into this by path. Nobody else? No, I can remember nobody who ever took the slightest interest in it. It's not, somehow, the sort of thing that does interest people. What I mean to say is, there's not much use in it, is there? Sir Clinton diverged for an instant from his usual reticence. Thank you for listening to today's episode. I really hoped you enjoyed it. There will be more to come. Please subscribe not to miss out on what is next. I will be looking forward to your return. The music is by Madfan from Pixabay. To support this and other artists, go to pixabay.com. Sheila.